Welcome everybody. I'm talking today about what is pragmatist, about the new pragmatist philosophy of science. This talk serves maybe three different purposes. One is introducing philosophers of science and people interested in philosophy of science to the tradition of philosophical pragmatism. One is assessing new views within the philosophy of science that call themselves pragmatist. And the third is to practice for a talk I'm giving at a conference next week. And so I would be grateful for any feedback you can give about what could be clearer or what have you. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. That's what I've got at the conference. So I'll just get into it. So philosophical pragmatism has been enjoying something of a renaissance lately, particularly in the field of philosophy of science. That trend's not entirely new. It really began decades ago with thinkers like Hilary Putnam, Philip Kitcher, Peter Godfrey Smith, and Arthur Fine. But the last 10 years have seen something of an explosion of work in pragmatist philosophy of science. So in this talk, I'm going to look at some very recent work under this heading and bring it into a conversation with classical pragmatism in order to explore the question, what makes the philosophy of science pragmatist? I'm not going to assert there's some univocal answer to this question, but rather I'm not going to try to sort the true pragmatist from the false pragmatist, but I'm going to try to articulate the value of the recent work in light of the old work, and also aspects of the old tradition that have yet to receive their proper due in recent philosophy of science. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on two recent books. Hasek Chang's book from 2022, Realism for Realistic People, A New Pragmatist Philosophy of Science, and the edited collection, The Pragmatist Challenge, Pragmatist Metaphysics for Philosophy of Science. There's other work in this general area, but these are pretty prominent and representative figures in the new work. So I want to start by asking what makes philosophy of science pragmatist, and I think the first thing we need to ask is what is pragmatism in general, right? Here's one prominent contemporary definition that tries to cover both the classical tradition and contemporary work in pragmatism by Kathy Legg and Christopher Hookway. Pragmatism is a philosophical tradition, very broadly, that understands knowing the world as inseparable from agency within it. This definition is not entirely uncontroversial. For one, it centers knowing, which some people would not agree with, but I think it is a pretty good first run. Let's look at what some of the, give me just a second. Let's see. Kinks to work out. Okay. So the new pragmatist trend in philosophy of science is in some sense a return to the classical tradition of pragmatism. The most well-known classical pragmatists here, Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, were all first and foremost philosophers of science and scientists. Peirce worked as a mathematician, a metrologist, an experimental scientist. James and Dewey worked as psychologists. Dewey was one of the originators of the field of experimental pedagogy. Other less perhaps well-known, although barely so at this point, pragmatists or pragmatist adjacent thinkers such as Jane Addams and W.B. Du Bois. Also, their pragmatist philosophies were closely connected with their work in both of their cases as innovative sociologists. I actually think that the recent work I'm going to talk about is more faithful to some of the classical ideas than work that has gone by the name pragmatist in decades past. I'll talk about that. But let's talk about how our classical thinkers define pragmatism. William James was the first to discuss pragmatism in print. He gave various definitions, but here's one. He defines pragmatism as the doctrine that the whole meaning of a conception expresses itself in practical consequences, either in the shape of conduct to be recommended or in that of experiences to be expected if the conception be true, and would be different if it were untrue. Right? Now, James himself, although he was the first to use the term this way in print, gave credit to Charles Peirce for using the term first in discussion groups decades earlier in the 1870s. And Peirce gives a fairly similar definition. He says, pragmatism is the opinion that metaphysics is to be largely cleared up by the application of the following maximum for attaining clearness of apprehension. Consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have, then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object, right? You can see one difference here is that Peirce is specifically referring to it as a means for clearing up metaphysics, right? Part of philosophy, often done in a more rationalistic way. And Peirce himself thought this was just sort of making explicit a common procedure in science for how you define terms, right? You make clear what the consequences of the terms are for various kinds of practical operations. Okay. And then lastly, John Dewey gives a somewhat different spin on the idea, proposing or focusing on practical judgment. He says all judgments are practical judgments in the sense of practical reasoning, ethical or everyday decision making. And he defines pragmatism as the hypothesis that all judgments of fact have reference to a determination of courses of action to be tried and to the discovery of means for their realization. Their truth would coincide with tested consequences affected by intelligent action. Now, Dewey's view, and I'll return to this at the end, implies, I think, that all inquiry, including all scientific inquiry, has a place for values, has value-laden aspects. In my own work, I have stuck closer to Dewey in thinking about pragmatism as primarily a thesis about inquiry and judgment as practical. Okay. So these are some of the classic takes or classic definitions of pragmatism. Let's look at how some of the more recent philosophers of science talk about pragmatism. Hasek Chang in Realism for Realistic People emphasizes coherence, pluralism, and realism as features of pragmatism, and gives sort of multiple characterizations throughout the book, right? So he says, pragmatism regards knowledge as the outcome of humble on-the-ground inquiry and locates it in actual intelligent activities that we carry out in life. Pragmatist philosophers have clearly recognized the need to understand and assess knowledge in the context of action. I want pragmatism to be a philosophy that helps us think better about how to do things, not just about what our words mean in relation to actions. And he says the staunch empiricism at the core of pragmatism also encompasses methodology, method learning as an empirical process, as much as any other kind of learning. Okay. The book, the edited collection, The Pragmatist Challenge, comes out of the so-called Pragmaps group associated with the University of Pittsburgh. They're thinking about pragmatism as a way of doing the metaphysics of science, thinking about what science implies for our understanding of the nature of the whole world, right? The nature of existence, what kinds of commitments we make when we accept scientific theories. And this group did a series of workshops over the last perhaps 10 years exploring these topics. Holly Anderson and Sandra Mitchell start out in their introduction by defining, by telling us that metaphysical and epistemological questions about existence and knowledge, come to their sharpest form when considered in the light of our most effective scientific practices. There's an affinity between these kinds of this kind of information. And they tell us pragmatist philosophy of science involves rejecting the view of knowledge that involves striving for in principle unattainable ideals for which one must resign oneself to never achieving, right? Absolute conceptions of truth, right, are our ultimate aim, something like that. Pragmatism involves having a different goal, not giving up on an idealistic goal, but having a different, more worthy goal. James Woodward, in his contribution to the volume, characterizes pragmatism as an emphasis on what is useful, where this is understood in a means-ends framework, and a rejection of spectator theories of knowledge that treat the knower as passive, right, receiver of information. And skepticism about certain ways of thinking about representation in science and about ambitious forms of metaphysics. Holly Anderson, in her contribution, tells us that pragmatism aptly navigates the space between knee-jerk scientism and anti-science, anti-expertise trends, characterizing pragmatism as many have often done as a kind of via media philosophy, middle way philosophy. And then David Danks, I think, helpfully distinguishes between three ways that a philosophy of science might be pragmatist. Depending on whether we're talking about the philosophy pragmatist science, where the science is characterized as a pragmatic pursuit, where scientists are taken to have a pragmatist attitude towards their subject matter, or a pragmatist philosophy of science, where the philosopher takes a pragmatist approach to philosophy, right? This permits the possibilities of realist philosophy of pragmatist science, which Danks thinks most avowed pragmatists are actually doing, and pragmatist philosophy of realist science, which Danks thinks characterizes much of the contemporary work on scientific methodology that's not explicitly called pragmatist, but which is aimed at improving scientific methodology, as well as a pragmatist philosophy of pragmatist science, which Danks thinks there hasn't been much of, but I think actually Hasek Chang's book is trying to do that kind of work. I've been trying to do similar work in my own research on science and values. So those are the three options there. Okay. So that's a lot of quotes, a lot of ideas throwing around. Let's try to bring some order to it, right? Between the classical pragmatists and the new pragmatists, what is pragmatism and what is a pragmatist philosophy of science? According to the pragmatists, the classical pragmatists, pragmatism is about clarifying meaning through connection with practical consequences. Pragmatism is about understanding truth in terms of relations between action and expected consequences. And following Dewey, science is inherently practical and value-laden. Epistemology and metaphysics, therefore, inextricable from ethics and politics. The new pragmatists emphasize knowledge as a tool for more effective and efficient action. Method learning as empirical, replacing unattainable ideals with attainable goals, charting a middle way between scientism and anti-science, and providing a kind of functional or means-ends analysis, right? These are, I think, broadly compatible visions of what pragmatism is in most respects. Although the new pragmatists, I think, tend to focus on different commitments than the ones the classical pragmatists thought were definitive of pragmatism. But many of these are commitments that you find somewhere in one of the classic 3 or 5 or 10 figures, however many you think are classic pragmatists. Perhaps the major distinction, and again, this will be what I discuss at the end of the talk, is the new pragmatists don't say much about values. They don't say much about the ethical and political consequences of a pragmatist view of knowledge. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, this is not the first time in recent history that philosophers have tried to appropriate the term pragmatism for what they wanted to do. An earlier version of this has sometimes been referred to as neo-pragmatism, which includes at least Hilary Putnam and Richard Rorty, maybe goes as far back to Quine and Goodman in the mid-century, and something that careful scholars of people like Peirce, James, and Dewey have often criticized. I think one of the most interesting features of the new pragmatist philosophy of science, to someone who's been interested in this stuff for a long time, is that the new pragmatist philosophers of science have a kind of confidence in traditional pragmatist ideas that had previously been considered disreputable. Earlier neo-pragmatist appropriations of pragmatism tended to accept some broad metaphilosophical insights, perhaps some took some epistemological insights, but they took a very critical approach to pragmatist metaphysical and semantic views on things like truth, meaning, and reality. And so what I'm going to talk about next is views from the new pragmatists on metaphysics and on truth, and how those connect with the older kinds of views. Okay. So the new pragmatist philosophers of science are pretty insistent on the intertwining of metaphysics, epistemology, and scientific practice. We've already seen one quotation from the introduction to the Pragmatist Challenge that emphasized this intertwining, right? They tell us actually this is the core idea of a Pragmatist Challenge, not a rejection of philosophical metaphysics, but offering an alternative approach to metaphysical inquiry that is closer in spirit to natural philosophy, closely integrating metaphysical and epistemological considerations, right? Exploring the nature of reality and how we know about the nature of reality have to go together. And they have to go with an understanding of scientific practice, right? Chang says the same. The neat separation is impossible to maintain. Some of the new pragmatist philosophers of science are fairly cautious about this, though. So this is a point where there's a bit of difference. Someone like Jim Woodward emphasizes that we're looking for a minimal rather than an ambitious metaphysics, right? What was bad about sort of old philosophical metaphysics is that it was too ambitious. And when pragmatist philosophers are criticized by metaphysicians for failing to articulate proper metaphysical underpinnings for science, pragmatists should push back by demanding to be shown why such underpinnings are necessary. Edward Hall, who also has an essay in this book, similarly argues for a respectful deflationism rather than robust realism or eliminativism. David Danks says that when we adopt a pragmatist perspective, we can talk about things like the unification of scientific theories in a more minimal way, one that doesn't require us to commit to kind of very ambitious claims about the nature of reality. But there are other approaches that are more ambitious. Sandra Mitchell, for example, argues in her contribution to the Pragmatist Challenge that what is justifiably real in science are J.J. Gibson's style affordances that are produced by scientists interacting with nature. Right? According to Mitchell, affordances for Gibson are real objective properties of the environment plus organism that make specific behaviors possible. Right? This is the thing that scientists investigate, according to Mitchell. It's these kind of environment plus organism interactions. A view that really echoes John Dewey's own view of organism-environment interaction as sort of centrally defining the nature of experience and inquiry. Hasek Chang also has a very ambitious form of pragmatist metaphysics. He argues that we should define an entity as real. An entity is real to the extent that there are operationally coherent activities that can be performed by relying significantly on its existence and its properties. When we say something like the placebo effect is real, we are expressing our judgment that the named thing is operative in some processes of experience, processes of scientific, or in this case, medical practice. Right? There's clearly a variety of views here. There were also a variety of metaphysical views amongst the classical pragmatists. They're, I think, unified by the way in which the pragmatists, new and old, think that these sort of metaphysical ideas about what reality is have to be constrained by an understanding of scientific practice. Earlier neo-pragmatists and many other philosophers of the 20th century were very negative on pragmatist views of truth. But several of the new pragmatist philosophers of science are quite interested in developing ideas about truth that they find in James, Dewey, and Peirce. Hasek Chang defines truth as operational coherence. He says a statement is true to the extent that there are operationally coherent activities that can be performed by relying on its content, right? Chang himself takes this to be very close in some respects to what James and Dewey were doing with truth, but read through a view of operationalism and coherentism that he's developed in prior work. He defines operational coherence in this way. A matter of making elements of our activities fit together harmoniously so that our aims may be achieved, right? So what makes a claim, a hypothesis, a theory true, according to Chang, is not some one-to-one correspondence between that statement or that law or that theory and reality, as if we knew how to do that kind of corresponding, but the fact that when we rely on that claim or law or theory in a set of activities that fit together, they cohere and they operate effectively. I think this is, he also refers to this as aim-oriented coordination. It's always activity for some goal, right? This, I think, is very similar in some ways to what Dewey refers to as the functional fitness that defines warranted assertability in inquiry, right? But I think there's a difference, right? So we could represent Chang's operational coherence idea this way. We have a bunch of activities, scientific activities, prediction, explanation, experiment, reasoning, mathematical calculation of a specific kind, right? And they work together to achieve certain aims, right? Control of natural phenomena, prediction and anticipation of natural phenomena, perhaps. And if this is successful, right, then we've got truth here in the system, right? But the question a view like this faces is whether these sort of this coherent set of activities is really making the right kind of contact with reality, right? Coherentists are often accused of proposing a sort of system that might, for all we know, be floating in the void rather than being really somehow getting the right kind of friction from the world, right? And I think this is problematic in Chang's own view because he defends a kind of a form of mind dependence of truth and reality in terms of what he calls mind framing. Everything, according to Chang, is structured in some way by our concepts, right? Chang tells us in his book that real entities are mind framed because all entities are mind framed, right? They're structured by concepts that we have posited. mentally, so to speak, right? All that we can ever think or talk about are mind-framed entities because talking and thinking presuppose the very conceptual structures that make those things intelligible, right? So it's natural to wonder whether Chang's account can maintain its grasp on reality or whether it collapses into a kind of problematic form of relativism. Right? Chang attempts to disarm the concern by telling us that mind framing is not the same as mind control, right? Like the bad sort of idealist metaphysics assumes that there's a kind of direct, willful control of the mind over reality, which Chang denies. I mean, some realities, like what I'm having for breakfast, that's kind of controlled by my mind in a lot of ways, but not most reality, right? But I think there's no way really for Chang, who's committed to the pervasiveness of mind framing, to avoid a certain kind of worry about relativism. And he shouldn't have to, because there's lots of ideas from pragmatism that can help with this, right? There's lots of displays of knowledge, what Chang himself calls active knowledge, where we aren't talking or thinking, right? We are rather engaged in what Hubert Dreyfus calls skillful coping in the world, right? We're engaged in a kind of habitual, skillful activity, right, as an exercise of knowledge. And yet, Chang doesn't want to go there. He seems to think that mind framing, which depends on conceptual propositional knowledge, is present even in these cases, in cases where we're sort of directly doing things and having experiences, not only sort of cognitive, intellectual experiences. Right? And I think this matters from a pragmatist point of view precisely because of Dewey's argument that it is a kind of pre-framed, unsettled situation that spurs inquiry and serves as ultimate criterion. Right? So, although this is my own sort of schematic view of Dewey's account of inquiry, right? While it bears resemblance to Chang's own view, in that there is a kind of what Dewey calls functional correspondence, what Chang calls operational coherence, right? That is crucial to attributing truth or warrant or assertability to theories, facts, results of science. It's placed in a kind of active, practical, non-mind frame situation that is the sort of criterion of success of that kind of scientific work, right? It's the transformation, Dewey tells us, of a situation from problematic, unsettled, indeterminate, doubtful, to one that is settled, unified, tractable, predictable, that represents the course of inquiry, right? The achievement of a settled situation is the constitutive criterion of success. How we know we've achieved that, right? Well, we're never certain we've achieved that, right? That's an epistemic question, right? But not one that Chang takes advantage of, right? Holly Anderson, in her contribution to the Pragmatist Challenge, gives us a different account of truth, truth as truing, which in certain respects is more open to some of these pragmatist ideas. The idea of truing is with analogy to truing a wheel, right? So Anderson tells us we should think about truth in science not as a static property of individual propositions, but instead as a state into which knowledge products can be brought, out of which they can fall, where truth is a process-oriented activity. It is aptly called truing, and knowledge products like models can be in true or out of true. So when you true a bicycle wheel, you adjust the spokes one by one, right? But you can't sort of pull one spoke out and say, is the spoke true, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's a matter of the whole coordination of the system, right? Not unlike not unlike the kind of holism you see in both Chang and Dewey, but Anderson here is thinking of this as precisely a practical, process-oriented activity. She also says there isn't a fixed threshold such that above it a wheel is in true and below it is out of true, right? It's a matter of degree. It's physically impossible to have a perfectly in true wheel, even in the best case scenario, right? And as I said, it's meaningless to ask if any individual spoke is in true, right? The wheel isn't true because of the positions and tensions of the spokes, right? Anderson emphasizes, I think quite correctly, the ways in which her view is capturing key ideas of William James on truth, right? Including the idea that truth is indexed to a time and a place, that truth is something that happens to an idea, and the truth is something that helps us get on in the world, right? So I think assuming that we are satisfied with the way that Anderson cashes out the metaphor of truing, this is a quite interesting take on a pragmatist theory of truth, right? Okay, so that's pragmatist. That's the new pragmatists on truth and metaphysics. I want to end the discussion with the final topic I want to focus on is kind of pragmatist philosophy of science. Avoid addressing science and values, right? So one issue that receives little attention in the recent work in pragmatist philosophy of science is the topic of science and values in a broad sense, right? The question of what the proper relationship is between ethical values and scientific knowledge, between political values and scientific knowledge, political processes and scientific knowledge. Now, the authors in the new pragmatist authors do acknowledge the significance of this question, right? Hasek Chang tells us that thinking about knowledge as ability brings knowledge inescapably into the context of action, where values are immediately present. But this consideration sits in the background of the book without ever really being thematized. It's sort of left at the end of the book. It's explicitly left at the end of the book as a kind of topic for future work, right? Somebody else should do this, right? Anderson and Mitchell and other thinkers in the Pragmatist Challenge volume similarly acknowledge that the connection between practice and science, between action and science, bring up connections with values that scientists might be making, value-laden choices, that there might be a link between science and other social institutions and policy. But again, they don't really take it up. It's not an issue that they thematize, right? So although the new pragmatists acknowledge the importance of values in politics and science, they tend not to provide any analysis of it. And I think that's a shame from the point of view of classical pragmatism, which increasingly, as we move from Peirce to Dewey, centers the focus on these kinds of questions, right? Already starting with Charles Peirce, we get an intimate connection between belief, desire, and action, right? Belief either is or establishes a habit, right? They're intimately connected in that way. It's our belief should be for Peirce such that they may truly guide our actions so as to satisfy our desires, right? So the kinds of practical evaluation of beliefs, scientific and otherwise, is in some way tied to what we desire to do with that knowledge, right? The essence of belief is the establishment of a habit, and different beliefs are distinguished by the different modes of actions to which they give rise, right? Similarly, linking belief and action. That said, Peirce doesn't follow up too much explicitly with a connection to ethics and politics in science, and at some moments really wants to keep science above the fray of values. William James draws an even more explicit connection. In his famous essay, The Will to Believe, which primarily is concerned with religious belief, but also talks about other forms of belief, he tells us that believe truth and shun error are the two materially different laws that color differently our whole intellectual life. They're not the same, right? If what you really want to do is believe the truth, you may you may believe a lot of errors in the course of that, right? But you don't want to let the truth evade your grasp. If what you really want to do is shun error, you may withhold belief from a lot of true things, right? This argument would be revived and strengthened first in the mid 20th century by pragmatist philosophers like Richard Rudner and C. West Churchman, and at the start of this century by Heather Douglas in her work on science and values. She adopts the language of false positive and false negative errors instead of believe truth, shun error. But her point is the same. We always face a trade-off between relatively higher or lower standards for accepting a belief or a hypothesis or a claim, and the how high we set the bar may have not only intellectual but also practical, social, ethical consequences, right? If you're, to use a famous example from Rudner, if you're judging the quality of belt buckles, right, a relatively low bar for your methodology may be fine, right? If you're judging the safety of a chemical or a medicine, right, you may want a rather higher standard, lower false positive rate, right, for making safety claims like that, right? That's an ethical question, right, that guides scientific methodology. Dewey, like James, points explicitly to the pervasive and continuous role of choice in inquiry. Not only the sort of broad level, believe truth, shun error, but the continuous way in which scientists are faced with choices about how to carry on the inquiry that they engage with, right? What observations to undertake, what experiments to carry on, what lines of reasoning and mathematical calculations to pursue, right? And those aren't questions that can be settled once and for all. They have to be continually judged anew as inquiry evolves. Research is an activity, and the decisions made in the course of research are choices to act in certain ways, ways that are governed not only by sort of pure reason, but also by things like social purpose and welfare, right? Which Dewey takes to be governing criteria in the formation of beliefs, right? Practical and social interests, as much as cognitive or intellectual ones, are at play. And in one of his most important essays, The Logic of Judgments of Practice, Dewey explicitly argues that all inquiry involves evaluations, right? Judgments of practice, judgments about what to do. And that science itself is a mode of practice or a practical art, right? In other words, all reasoning is a species of practical reasoning. There's no purely theoretical value-free reasoning. Right? So we could extract from these thinkers a kind of explicit argument against the idea that science is value-free, right? First, inquiry aims to remove an inability to act, doubt, and replace it with a stable policy for action, belief. The logic of inquiry involves making decisions under uncertainty, what's come in more recent years to be called inductive risk. These decisions, by definition, have consequences for how we act. Decisions about how to act should involve ethical value judgment, broadly construed. And so scientific inquiry requires ethical and other forms of value judgment. There are other pragmatist philosophers of science writing today who focus much more on these sorts of issues, but are also more firmly, perhaps formally situated in the historical scholarship on classical pragmatism. I'll mention two, Pierluigi Birota in his book Scientist, Democracy, and Society. I've tried to do something with pragmatism in this direction in my book, Science and Moral Imagination. My note of caution about the new pragmatist philosophy of science is that we not make the mistake of earlier revivals of the pragmatist tradition by focusing exclusively, in this case, on epistemological and metaphysical aspects of pragmatism to the exclusion of the ethical and political. We should, I think, follow the advice that Dewey provides in a quotation I've long admired, right, which is that to work exclusively, and he's speaking to philosophers here, to work exclusively within the context provided by the scientists themselves, by the sciences themselves, is to ignore their vital context. The place of science in life, the place of its peculiar subject matter in the wide scheme of materials we experience, is a more ultimate function of philosophy than is any self-contained reflection upon science as such. Yeah, that's my talk. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions, discussion. We'll be eager for feedback. Yeah,
I'll
Gary.
try to start off on put things into a short form. Do any of these provide leverage to actually criticize scientists when they basically go insane? My my perspective is it's a standard model of gravitational cosmology and string theory. Some of the new pragmatisms where they want to take a very conservative view strikes me as being they have to accept the science as it's given and they can't criticize it. But for example, gravitational cosmology, all of which is based on Einstein's general theory of relativity, has been profoundly problematic. At least I've been aware of how problematic for 25 years, and others have been aware of it longer than that. But the trouble is they've got a model, and they're not going to allow any empirical data to interfere with that model. As soon as they get catastrophic falsification after catastrophic falsification, instead all they do is come up with a new parameter that they shoehorn, stovepipe into the model, and oh look, the model works. And they're doing it even today. Webb telescope. This stuff catastrophically falsifies the theory, and the very next sentence is Einstein is right. And you can't have those two positions. But I mean, but the problem goes back way before Webb, and Webb was only making things more acute. You're starting to see a few scientists. I mean, there have always been a few scientists who said it was wrong. I mean, you go back and see people like Michael Disney with no relationship to the mouse. You know, pointing out the problematic nature of these extra parameters. You had people who were offering alternative theories, but the model centrists were so committed to the model that the model can, like I say, catastrophic falsification, no problem. We just come up with a new parameter. Alternate theory, the slightest, most infinitesimal deviation from observational data, and it's immediately rejected. My question is, do any of these pragmatists provide leverage to criticize this, to actively criticize science rather than just simply accepting it?
Yeah, good question. So I think here the distinction that David Danks draws between whether the pragmatist is applied to the philosophy or to the science is important, right? So um, uh, what Danks calls realist philosophy of pragmatist science, which he takes a lot of earlier pragmatist philosophers of science to really be doing, um, does, I think, sort of take the science for granted in the way that you're worried about, right? Whereas pragmatist philosophy of science, whether the science is conceived as pragmatist or realist, right, is critical, right? Is concerned primarily with how can we improve the practices of science, right? So we see this in work by people like Jim Woodward, who's in the collection, but also uh, Judea Pearl, who are trying to improve methods of causal reasoning. Um, uh, Hasek Chang is quite explicit, actually, about this, that the goal is really to make science better through kind of critical investigation. Chang's primary interest there is looking at, um, science has kind of conflicting urges towards the kind of pluralism, sort of open debate amongst a variety of alternative perspectives, and um, a more um, dogmatic view that tries to resolve controversy and generate consensus. And Chang is really pushing towards the pluralism and away from the dogmatism, right? And he sees this as um, conflicting urges in both philosophy and science that need to be addressed. So I think, um, uh, without speaking to the specific example, because there's a lot of complication to get into, I think yes, some of these thinkers definitely do have more of a critical approach, and I would distinguish, sort of the late 20th century pragmatist philosophers of science from the new pragmatist philosophers of science. Around this would be one of the ways I would distinguish them. Thanks, Gary. Other questions? Comments? Yeah.
I have a question, and I apologize in advance because I'm not going to be able to phrase this with correct philosophical terminology because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a geologist, but I'm interested in philosophy of science. So I'm curious about how the new pragmatism that you described would view scientific models that are sort of beyond the veil of direct observation, but generate a consistent worldview and generate predictable phenomenon. So I'll use as an example, the best thing that I could come up with is the idea of quarks as fundamental particles. So no one has observed a quark. No one has directly measured an individual quark. But as a scientific model, if you accept the idea that there are these specific types of quarks and they have these specific properties and they interact in these specific ways, then that generates testable predictions about phenomenon that we can observe. And many of those, in fact, have been tested and verified. Like when something is in that sort of gray area of making testable predictions, but is not really directly accessible with our current technology, what would the new pragmatists say about a question such as, are quarks real?
Yeah.
Are quarks truth? Are quarks knowledge? And do they make any distinctions between those questions?
Yeah. Good question. There are two kinds of ideas that you see in this work that are relevant to that question. One of them is, and some people are more explicit about this than others. I'm trying to think. I can't point to a specific writing, but a lot of people acknowledge the fact that what counts as observable or experienceable is not so tightly connected to the sort of naive operation of our senses, right? Uh, there are all kinds of limitations there that are irrelevant to our understanding of nature, right? And one of the things that science does, and Dewey emphasized this a lot, is it creates tools for expanding our experience further out and deeper into nature, right? Whether it's telescopes, microscopes, it gets very sophisticated very fast, right? So that's one kind of thing, right? Um, so insofar as we talk about observing atoms, electrons, distant galaxies, right? Um, those are observable on a par with tables and chairs, right? For many of these pragmatists. That's not going to cover questions like quarks, right? Which are much more inferential, much less directly observable. So the other kind of idea is the one that you see in Chang or in Holly Anderson, right? Which is talking about truing a wheel, right? I mean, you can think about the spokes on the wheel as parameters in a model, right? Um, it doesn't so much matter that you can't see a quark, right? That we don't even have indirect technologically mediated way of getting observational contact with a quark, right? The fact that it features as one piece of a complicated model and all the pieces of the model fit together to generate very useful prediction and engagement with the world is the sense in which our ideas about quarks are true, right? For Anderson. And Chang would tell a similar story with his conception of operational coherence, right? Some pragmatists are going to want to draw a distinction between those two ways of approaching the problem, right? Or to say there is a kind of important difference between those things that we have even sort of distantly technological empirical contact with, and those things which really are features of an abstract model that we use to understand the world, right? Um, Others are going to think that's not such an important difference. That's going to be a matter of some disagreement, right? Whether that distinction is important in terms of how true or how real we treat the more inferential ones.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So
I
with
think
the,
that's a disagreement actually you see in the classical pragmatists as well.
so so would the new pragmatists maybe draw a distinction between, okay, well, the entire model, the entire wheel taken together, we can regard as true in a certain sense.
Mhm.
But even if we cannot absolutely verify that every spoke, that
Right.
every aspect of the model
Yeah.
must be true.
So they might say, um, the the entities within that are posited by that model are real insofar as the model as a whole is true in this way, right? Um, while recognizing that that judgment is derivative, right? Yeah.
And by true, I'm just like to build on this. When you said it's true because it works,
Yeah.
like, and so do these new pragmatists have is what you're describing like an ontological, like, is this like and maybe that's where the debate is whether they care about that so much or not.
Yeah. So I think the conception of truth is explicitly rejects a picture where there's the human world over here and there's the natural world over there, and they don't really interact. And truth is a matter of, is this thing that exists in our model or our language, is that a structure that's there in the world, right? Um, the pragmatists tell us that's the wrong way to think about the activity of knowing, right? Knowing is about getting dirty in the world, interacting with it, doing stuff, and truth is a feature of those activities, right? And it's maybe a feature that is um, not digital, not yes, all or nothing. Yeah. Um, but it's an insistence on the active quality of knowing, and then what are the consequences that follow for how we can make sense of our old concepts like truth, reality, etc. If we reform our conception of knowledge. Funny.
Mine is more feedback than question. I thought it was really well organized, and I had several questions come up throughout, and you answered every one of them. So just a tiny little question that's more just a personal
Yeah.
reflection from you. One of the very first slides is the dictionary, I think Stanford dictionary definition of pragmatism, and you had said kind of offhandedly, the word knowing here could be contentious. And then, of course, you went on to talk about knowing and truth and all of these things. But if you were to replace the word knowing there, what would you replace it with?
Yeah. Um, so I think that so if we were to follow Peirce or James, we would put the primary emphasis not on knowing, but on meaning, right? That the meaning of ideas is connected with their consequences, right? And that might include things that are part of knowledge and things that are part of other kinds of activities, right? Other uses of language.
Awesome.
And then if we had followed Dewey, we might think that what's really central is not so much knowledge or knowing, but practical judgment, right? Practical inquiry, figuring out what to do intelligently, which is kind of how Dewey would want to describe knowledge. So that's really splitting hairs. Maybe they're thinking actually in a more Deweyan direction, although they're both Peirce scholars, so that's sort of strange. Okay. Other questions? Other thoughts? Thank you, Sam. Oh yeah, Randy.
A suggestion about, so the spoke thing is mechanical as an example. The interesting thing is that the mechanical adjustments give rise to dynamic differences when you spin the wheel, right? So it's part of what makes the truing example sort of striking. But I would suggest that actually the mechanical character of that example misdirects the mind to I mean, we're sitting there thinking about adjusting and there's no perfect adjustment, whereas something like a strobe tuner would actually be a better example, because the adjustment of the tone by the musician, what's happening in a strobe tuner is that you've got multiple wheels, each of which is sensitive to a particular part of the sound waves, and it averages them for us. So such that when when the black things line up, what that means is that each of the wheels is getting the part of the sound wave that leads to its equilibrium going around, and then the whole thing lines up, and you got a black line that you can visually see, and the black line tells you that that's 8440 or something like that. But it's an average is the point. That in this case, instead of picturing somebody doing this and trying to get it, the dynamism is much livelier, in the sense that the musician is either adjusting the string, and that's like the spoke, but if you're tuning your trumpet, it's completely different, because one of the things you're doing is you're adjusting your embouchure, and the tone that you are emitting, extremely complex. And what it does is it converts tone into pitch, which are two completely different concepts. The tone is big; it's got the universe in it. The pitch is the reduction of that tone into something that we can define conceptually.
One number.
It's one number. Exactly. And so I think it's a better example, and I offer it to you completely for free. But the reason is that I don't think you want people imagining the mechanical process of trying to balance a wheel, which anybody who's ever worked on a bicycle has done, right? It's like the whole point of it is the dynamism, and that's the average.
Right.
But the dynamism is something that it's not quite right, adjust again. It's not quite right, adjust again. Whereas your stroke tuner, you adjust it as it happens.
Yeah.
And the image appears, and the image means the pitch is true.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I like that example for Dewey and purposes much better, but he was tone deaf. But but when it comes to keeping the people who are listening for the example in the mode of process,
Yeah.
right? There's something a little too mechanical about her example to suit.
Yeah. I like that. I like that metaphor for a couple of reasons. One is it is even more completely captures the holism of the process and the dynamism of the process. The other is that there is a kind of aesthetic component to the way that Dewey thinks about
That's right. Yeah.
how you know that all the pieces are fitting together, right?
It isn't just that you hear this in this, you're going to feel it with your body and you actually see it with your eye in the line of the stroke tuner. So
I think it's, this probably like one's hobbies also inform how these metaphors are, how compelling these metaphors
if you
are,
have
right?
a musician.
Randy's a musician.
That's
The
as
biggest
well.
problem with that
And-
example is that most people aren't musicians to the point that you'll have to, first of all, everybody's ridden a bicycle.
Yeah, and I
Well,
think
understand
Holly,
stroke. I mean, I hadn't heard of stroke until you mentioned it just now.
and if I'm not mistaken, Holly Anderson is a big of an amateur athlete.
Oh, okay.
Who does quite a lot of biking. So.
It does. Yeah. But anyway.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your questions and your feedback and just the opportunity to practice in front of a live audience. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.